Welcome, and thank you for joining us for a very special AI for Science panel discussion. I'm Lila Tretikov. I'm a partner and head of AI strategy at the global venture capital firm NEA. NEA has been around for nearly half a century, has more than 27 billion in assets under management, and has helped build over 1,000 companies. Over the years, we have always invested at the very edge of science and technology. We're extremely grateful for the opportunity to bring together today's luminary panel, especially because we believe the true purpose and the ultimate future of AI will be applied to the real world around us through amplifying scientific discovery. The opportunities that will bring will improve our livelihood beyond anything we can imagine. Our distinguished panelists will discuss current opportunities and also challenges to unblock along this journey. Thank you so much and enjoy the discussion.
My name is Trenton Jerde. I'm a senior editor at Nature Machine Intelligence. I will be the moderator tonight. So we'll first introduce the panelists. Max Welling is CuspAI co-founder and CTO, professor of machine learning at the University of Amsterdam. Anima Anandkumar is Bren Professor of Computing and Mathematical Sciences at Caltech, where she co-founded the AI for Science initiative. Bill Daly is Chief Scientist and Senior Vice President of Research at Nvidia, has made many contributions to AI hardware and compute. Marc Tessier-Lavigne is co-founder, CEO, and chair of the AI biotech firm Xaira, and has held academic positions including president at universities including Stanford, Rockefeller University, and UCSF. And David Haas, co-founder of Sakana AI and developer of the AI Scientist, among other contributions. They're all very distinguished. Those are the abbreviated versions, just for introductions. So the first question is, what does AI for science mean to you, or what is it that makes you excited about it in terms of building agents, letting AI discover new topics we haven't thought about, finding models that work across domains of science, et cetera?
I'll dive in. I think what's exciting to me is the idea that without huge amounts of funding, a scientist can have lots of assistants. And by having agents that can carry out the tasks that you might have postdocs do or graduate students do, it leverages scientists to get way more work done than they otherwise would. Now, on top of that are wonderful things like being able to do simulations thousands of times faster and less expensive than using numerical methods, and being able to solve long open problems like protein folding. But ultimately, I think it comes down to scientist productivity, and I think it's exciting to think about making scientists 10, 20 times as productive as they are today.
I can add to that. So if you can hear me, yes. So to me, it's precisely that understanding of the physical world at different levels, right? Like when we talk about agents and textual models, it's understanding what are the equations that model the physical world, for instance, and being able to reason about that. And then create new hypotheses, new ideas based on that textual knowledge. But that to me is just the first step, right? The deeper one is, given that we have all these great new ideas, what is the bottleneck? The bottleneck is still going and doing the physical experiments in the lab or going to the real world, collecting observations. That's the real bottleneck of science, right? Because science is not bottlenecked by the lack of ideas, but it's the ability to go try them out. And that's where the deeper physical understanding to me is the ability to go simulate, design, and control by fully understanding the physical system, being able to create a virtual or a digital twin of the physical world in all its complexities. And this is where, when I started at Caltech, there were so many different areas, different problems, but what are the mathematical underpinnings to solve many of them at once? And this is where partial differential equations, being a workhorse of simulations, modeling a lot of the physical world, is where we asked, how can AI solve this? And we invented neural operators as a way to extend standard neural networks to these function spaces, meaning the ability to not only handle one resolution or one scale of interaction, but any resolution and any scale, right? It could be, you can have phenomena all the way from atomic scales to planetary scales or even cosmological scales. Having the ability to model these multiple scales of interactions, a model that's not limited to just one resolution. That's what neural operators give the foundation. And then it was like, okay, how do we make this practical? And do a number of success stories. And one of the ones I'm really proud at, being at Nvidia at that time and creating an interinstitutional collaboration to build the first AI-based high-resolution weather model for CastNet. It was exactly about 4 years ago when Jensen announced this first at GTC. It was in the virtual, right, at that point. And after that, the rest is history, because we were the first to open source, give the model out to the world, ECMWF put that out there. And then weather scientists who were very skeptical were able to see, oh, this is able to predict hurricanes several days before standard physics-based weather models. This is tens of thousands of times faster, so I no longer need a supercomputer. I can run this on my local desktop. And then there were weather agencies across the world in countries which had less resources, being able to train on less, their local data very cheaply. And that has created this revolution in AI-based weather models and also now climate models. And that, to me, is just one application, right? We're talking about designing plasma and nuclear fusion, understanding the complexities of it, being able to design better drugs, better materials, better medical devices like a medical catheter where we showed 100x reduction in bacterial contamination. And all of these, to me, is just the beginning. But I think there is the need for good mathematical foundations to unlock these advances has been a key part of this.
For me, I'm really interested in the AI creativity aspect for AI for science. I think this technology has the ability to unleash many AI-driven discoveries. When I first started studying AI, I worked on things like world models and working for getting machines to be creative. And I think, LLMs can hallucinate. LLM agents do hallucinate. But what we were thinking about is this hallucination can be a feature rather than a bug. It can generate so many different ideas. And one of my gripes with LLMs is they're going to consume so much energy and resources. And one of our goals in our company is to use these LLMs and to come up with newer algorithms to make LLM training more efficient. So maybe hopefully counteract this sort of imbalance. And when we created the AI Scientist open source project last year, it was actually as a result of a paper we presented at NeurIPS 1 year ago called Disco Pop, where we found that these algorithms can come up with better training algorithms for LLM. Why not machine learning algorithms? And what we're applying this technology to now is finding new optimization algorithms where, we think that these algorithms can help optimize processes, schedules, and in general, make industries and make the world more efficient and more energy efficient, so that this would help counteract lots of these AI problems that we're going to face in the next few years.
Yeah, I can go next. So for me, it's all about impact. So I did my PhD thesis in two-dimensional quantum gravity, which means guaranteed zero impact in the world. And so I was very happy that, and then I did a detour into AI and machine learning, which was very cool. And there was already a little bit more impact then. But then recently these two fields came together, and I realized when they are merged, we can actually solve some of society's biggest problems, right? And so I'm talking about the energy transition, for instance, batteries. At CuspAI, we actually work on problems to clean water, so purify water from PFAS, which is very interesting. And solar cells, you can work on solar cells. There's very interesting new developments there with perovskites. And so we're going to see a huge sort of development in all of these fields. And I think, and then there's semiconductors, maybe not to forget. So we are in an age, I've heard something interesting, which is we're at the end of lithography and the beginning of materials in semiconductor space, because we've basically come to the limit of what you can still, do with lithography. And so if we want to keep Moore's law running, which is, basically producing most of the wealth in the world, if you think about it, then we really have to start coming up with new materials. And so it's this impact. So CuspAI was really founded around a worry that Chet and I had about climate change. And we work also on carbon capture materials, sorbent materials to capture carbon out of the atmosphere. And so I think we can now make, with this new, AI for science technology, we can really make a positive impact on society.
Bringing up the rear. Oh, Can you hear me? Great. So we work in the life sciences, and what our interest is in applying AI to transform how we discover and develop drugs. Currently, it's an incredibly inefficient process to go from choosing a molecular target to making the drug against that target, and then taking it through clinical trials takes on average 13 years. The attrition rate once molecules get into the clinic is about 90% failure. So a lot of trial and error, a lot of science, but a lot of trial and error, empiricism, intuition. It's still a very artisanal process. AI is transforming it in two ways. If you go in the middle, making drugs currently involves everybody's sort of high throughput screening. The promise of AI is being able to design drugs as opposed to screening for drugs. And we're already seeing that. There are molecules in clinical trials, molecules approaching clinical trials that have been designed with the help of AI. All of this is based on the same kind of foundation that everybody here is familiar with around AlphaFold, using AI to predict the structure of proteins, something that using physics-based methods, the field had stalled out by 2020. And the DeepMind group was able, with AlphaFold, to show you could break through that using AI and training on a very large set of protein structures, the protein data bank, 200,000 curated structures. So that has enabled us, and then our co-founder, David Baker, then pivoted to using generative AI to design entirely new proteins. So that's the kind of technology. I think that's going to make a huge difference to complementing some very powerful methods that we have already for making drugs. That's going to be great. The bigger win in the long run, I believe, will come from the problem of choosing targets and then matching the targets and the drugs to the patients. Again, most of the drugs that fail in clinical trials, it's not because the drug is a bad drug. It's because it's not clear whether the target matters and whether you match it to the right patients. You can have the best drug against the best target. You develop in the wrong patients, it will fail. So that matching problem is very important. The problem with biology is, unlike physics, we have no equations. Eric Schmidt has a very profound saying that AI is to biology what math is to physics. So since Newton, we know that we can understand the physical world, the inert world, through mathematical equations. They may be complicated, quantum gravity, things like that. But in biology, we have no equations. People tried for decades, probably since about 1950, to devise equations that would describe the behavior of cells. But cells are too bespoke. So many different interacting parts that arose through natural evolution. And so that has turned out to be a bust. AI, with its ability to see patterns that we can't see, if provided with the right kinds of data, can see those patterns and start to make predictions. So the big movement right now is to create the virtual cell. People have heard about that, presumably, where you take data on how cells respond to various perturbations, perturb every one of the 20,000 genes one at a time and see the effect on the 20,000 genes. Those kinds of data sets can be put into AI to start looking for patterns, understanding the networks, to then be able to answer questions like this. If a cell is in a disease state and you want to bring it to a healthy state, what genetic changes do you have to make? Today, prior to AI, you could say, we know there are 300 genes difference between here and here, but then you'd have to test them individually or in pairs and combinations to get there. AI can see the patterns to show the roadmap to go from here to there. It's that kind of acceleration through the power of AI to discern patterns that I think is going to transform choosing targets and matching them to patients. And it requires the kinds of data at scale that are just being generated now.
That's an excellent and unplanned segue to the next question, which is what makes for a suitable scientific problem for AI, such as large search spaces, scientific specific objective functions, abundant data, efficient simulators. I think that's the main question. I think an interesting reflection on that question also is for those topics that are amenable to AI for scientific discovery. It's also sort of interesting what might get left out or what might get pushed aside in science with this, but I'll open it to anybody who wants to discuss that.
I think, can you hear me? No. I think with the list, I would say viable simulators is key for AI for science. One of my concerns is with our current LLM technology, and if we combine it with great search algorithms like evolution, we can essentially scale up the search space and discover very, very good solutions to any simulator. That's why the
killer apps that generative AI is coding or finding optimization algorithms. And if we're going to continue to go to this road, most of the AI for science will be inside the coding domain. But I think if we want to have a broader applicability for this technology, we need to create really, really good and robust simulators. And I think this is a very open problem. What's the danger is if our simulators they're never good enough. Like these algorithms will always find the slightest flaw of your simulator, even the cell simulator that you're talking to, and discover some solution that would take advantage of that flaw, and it will not transfer over. So, I think there's a lot of talks about how we can increase the fidelity and whether that's an appropriate way. And I think there's a really important open problem, because once we can solve the sim to real gap, we can open up this AI scientist search problem to so many more scientific domains. And I think this is one of the most important challenges we have.
I think simulators are very important, but I would actually put my biggest endorsement on data. And if you look at areas where AI for science has been very successful, like weather and biological molecules, what has really enabled it is huge collections of data. For weather, we have historical observations, very dense back into the 1970s and sparse before that. And that has enabled us to train models that actually are better than the simulators. Because the simulators, aren't simulating down to Schrodinger's equation. They're making huge approximations. And if you simply train your models to mimic the simulators, they'll be no better than the simulators. If you train your models based on observations, you can do better than the simulators because you learn what the real physics are and not the approximation that somebody came up with to make it tractable and turn it into a bunch of equations. And if you look at molecules, I think Marc mentioned that AlphaFold, which to me is kind of the GPT moment of AI for science, was enabled because of the protein data bank. You had a huge data set that you could train the AI on, so it would learn these patterns that go from sequence to function and shape. And so I think data is the real enabler here, and there are certain parts of science which are data rich and certain parts that are data poor. And I think it's the data rich ones that we will exploit first, and it will be a challenge to bring the data poor ones into the fold.
And it's worth remembering the PDB started the first protein structures were put in the 1950s.
Mm-hmm.
But 70 years, typically one graduate student, one structure, 200,000 structures accumulated over 70 years that made AlphaFold possible. No other field of biology has that kind of data today currently.
And to me, to go beyond just the areas where it's data rich, right? What is really needed is some other knowledge, because to me, I think the true discoveries that are truly surprising and out there still, I would argue, haven't been made by AI. So what I call extrapolation. So being able to reason about systems that are much bigger than what were in training data. Yes, we may have good simulators, let's say, for small molecular systems, but we want to make predictions on much larger ones that we can't even possibly simulate, or climate models where we can't incorporate all the physics that is necessary to explain climate change, right? So those we don't even have simulations to begin with. How do we handle that? And that, to me, is, I think, the frontier. And there, in areas where physics, for instance, is known, physics-informed learning is really the key, right? Yes, utilize all the data that you have, but in a curriculum way, like the data tells you what happens in, let's say, simpler systems, or in a more approximate way. Like as Bill said, there's a whole hierarchy of simulators. Some are more exact than others, even in areas like physics where we know the equations. Just because we know the equation doesn't mean we can simulate it. It's much more expensive to simulate. But AI that can now handle this multi-fidelity data, right? So data coming from different simulators at different resolutions, at different levels of fidelity, different uncertainties, and then adding also the knowledge of physics to help go beyond what just the training data tells us. And that's really the key. And we've seen that succeed in a number of areas, especially with neural operators being able to handle these multi-resolution, multi-fidelity data. And then the key is you don't need a lot of data at the highest fidelity and highest resolution, right? And this is how we can overcome also the data scarcity issue, which happens in almost all of science except these few nuggets where we've made a lot of progress. And that, to me, I think involves better algorithmic development as well, because now if you're talking about data of multiple fidelities, resolutions, how do we kind of create that curriculum? How do we solve the optimization issues? Because with data-rich regimes, optimization is just works, right? We have Adam, you have all the standard methods, but now thinking about better optimization methods, in fact, the famous Millennium Prize problem in fluid dynamics, you may have seen the DeepMind paper before that a few months. We also made a really important contribution on being able to solve that in high precision on systems where we can discover these singularities in fluid dynamics. And their optimization is really the key bottleneck. And thinking of now better methods like we're doing, it brings back all of those kind of challenges, which in a way, deep learning with all the data-rich regime, which just swept under the rug. And so I agree with Ilya, it's the age of research coming back.
Gosh, all the good things have been said. If you come last, you have to really think about it. But anyway, I found something. I'll tell you. You want to say something?
No, there's no pressure. The first question was a lob for a softball to get everybody to, say something. But from now on, it's, hey, if it's been said, it's been said. I have more questions. I'm ready. Whatever you think.
I did think of something, actually. It's
okay.
A very, very important thing to say.
Good.
But, as a company, I can tell you what I have nightmares about, which is that you have made the perfect material first in your computer through simulation and beautiful optimization. And then comes the place where you need to synthesize it. And maybe you've solved that, which is already very difficult. And then you have to actually bring it into the real world, and you have to close the sim to real gap. And as a company, we haven't really gone through this entire process of having this beautiful material and then putting it in a real machine that people actually want to pay real money for and make an impact in the real world. And I just hope that process goes smooth. But that, I think you need to find a problem that gets you through that phase. And that's not trivial, I would say.
I'll just make one additional, since the question was about data. Also, one of the questions, I think a really interesting question for us, certainly in biology and drug discovery, is what data are going to move the needle the most? Because we have to generate very large amounts of data. The PDB, the Protein Data Bank, is fantastic, but it's limited ultimately. For example, the kinds of proteins that people most want to make as therapeutics are antibody protein, a certain type of protein that behaves very well in the body. There are only a few thousand structures of antibodies together with their targets in the PDB out of those 200,000 structures. So the question is, what more data would, again, move the needle in terms of being able to make antibodies against tough targets, for example, things that are pretty straight. There are certain targets that are pretty straightforward, and nobody really knows the answer to that. So there's going to be a lot of trial and error. Some of it can be done with simulation, but some of it will be done in the wet lab. You have to set up for rapid cycles of designing, making, testing wet lab. And same thing on the virtual cell. What data sets are going to be most robust and most informative to the model? Do you want to do all genes in a small number of cells, or a few genes in a lot of cells? You want to perturb genes simultaneously, for example, by pouring a drug on the cell so that a whole network gets activated. We don't yet know what is going to be most informative. So I think there's going to be a combination of science, machine learning, and trial and error to get away from trial and error. Ultimately, it's to build models where we don't have to have so much trial and error in the future.
I wanted to bring up the third pillar so far. We talked about data, we talked about algorithms, right? I said we should bring back a lot of optimization and other techniques. The third important pillar, of course, with Bill here, is compute, right? Hardware. And I think this is where, for science, the kind of compute that is needed going to be so massive than anything language models ever have needed. And when people ask me about, are we overbuilding? We barely have enough to even get started on some of the hard problems, especially in areas where I think about these very expensive simulations. Most of them are still like in CPU based. They are like requiring FP64, right, floating point representation, or even higher precision. And now we are asking, even AI as narrow surrogates are already making an impact because you're moving those workloads to the modern GPUs. But the real frontier is being able to model more of these very complex simulations at a level and fidelity that can replace much more of the real world experiments, real world, like kind of bottlenecks. And that requires us to, if you even just do a simple calculation, right? So let's remain in the Newtonian world before we go to the quantum, which is even more insane in the requirements of compute. The world around us is 3 dimensions in time, so 4 dimensions. And if you're thinking about phenomena like how waves propagate or heat transfers or fluid dynamics happen, like fluid flows or materials deform. You're thinking of like grids. If you start even at 100 by 100 by 100 by 100, that's like a billion. And if you ask for transformers with a billion context length, we just don't have anything like that running on any of our language models, right? So the hardware requirements for handling the physical world is so much more massive than anything that we've experienced so far. And it's going to be also memory-centric, bandwidth-centric, because just being able to handle that kind of data is so much more massive than what we even see with the biggest language models. And I think that's still just in the very early phases of what we need. And of course, maybe one day it'll be other kinds of computing, other aspects that I think Bill can comment more on. But it's still a massive bottleneck for us to have better compute, faster compute, cheaper compute to be able to handle even these complex data.
Yeah, I actually wanted to follow up on Mark's comment about data, because it's not the volume of data that's important. A lot of people get confused about that. And this is true whether you're training an LLM or training a weather model. It's having diversity of data and coverage of data. And what we find is you often have too many samples of a nice day in San Diego like this, and no samples of some interesting weather phenomena that you'd like to have your model be able to predict. And if you have no samples of it, it's not going to be able to predict it. I mean, probably the place this is shown up most, actually, it's not really science, but is our autonomous vehicle program, where we have reams of data of driving a car down Highway 101 with everybody behaving themselves, which is not very interesting. And to actually make a car be useful, you have to cover these edge cases that may never occur, but the average driver will probably never see it in their lifetime. But your training data set has to include it so that your car will know what to do in these situations. And simply for the weather model or the biological model, you need to have enough diversity of data and enough coverage. It's not just about volume.
I just want to very quickly comment on the weather, because you mentioned, because yes, we don't have data everywhere, but just to very quick on that. But on the other hand, what we were surprised when we even did the first model was how well it did on hurricanes, even though there weren't many hurricanes, because it was a very strong physical signature of hot and cold air mixing. And so some of our intuitions of what we think what machine learning requires is also different from in the physical world. It's not, as you said, the amount of data, but the right physical signatures. So sometimes the world could be more benign than what we expect, or maybe we don't need as much data because the physical world has a lot more structure. Just wanted to quickly.
So this panel really runs all by itself. Let's just retire here. I also wanted to add something to the computation sort of paradigm, which is my dream is actually that physics experiments are viewed as part of computation. So I think the physics processing unit, or the PPU, it's a computational. It's like the nature doing the computation for you. It's kind of hard to program because you have to set up the experiment, but it is part of kind of the same pipeline. As quantum computing is already sort of closer edging into that, but I think of an experiment as a computation done by nature, which is inherently extremely efficient, and then integrating the platform, so that the computational side with the experimental side, with so basically an agent deciding when to do a computation, at what level of complexity to do the computation, or when to do an experiment, and all integrating this into one big platform.
Good. They're so brilliant. They just answered one of the next questions, which was compute algorithms and data generation, which is being underestimated. It's unplanned. All right, well, shift a little bit. What components of the scientific method will AI fully automate or almost fully automate and surpass humans? For example, formulating hypotheses, designing and executing experiments, reviewing, writing, and communicating science. Which areas do you think or which of these components will AI fully automate?
Well, I think AI,
We're excited. The AI scientist guy.
This one's really exciting. It's actually a point that I want to bring up. I think, as we see this technology progress, like now we use the term AI. 5 to 10 years ago, it was machine learning. AI was a hype term, right? And machine learning at the time was more used for like a search, like finding solutions for well-defined search space. Then we got the AlphaFold, and now AI can get to like discovering new processes and structures. But I want to challenge this community to go beyond that. Like, I think with generative AI agents and the future of this technology, we might be able to embark on the possibility of agents formulating new ideas themselves. This is something historically humans have been doing really well. If we think of something like the entropy, Shannon's entropy, it can be applied to information theory, but at the same time, it can also be applied to chemistry, right? And I think agents, generative AI is not a domain-specific technology. It can absorb general different fields. I would like to see us using AI agents to study different sorts of disciplines and use this technology to fuse disciplines and come up with new ideas that are more cross-disciplinary. I think that in a few years or even next year, this AI technology would be able to combine ideas from chemistry and apply it to, even to aerodynamics or even to math. So I'm really excited in applying this technology to discover new innovations. One of the things that I think this community will need to step away from is more like a reward-driven optimization. It's like we have to get away from getting machines to do graduate student descents, basically. I mean, right now, when we task an AI to do something, we give them a reward. How good is it to solve this, matching, come up with a drug that can solve this simulator. I mean, when we're grad students, our profs would tell us to do something, but the most interesting things we've been doing is to come up with our own ideas, figure out what's interesting to us. And I think my challenge is to get these AI agents to also come up with what's interesting to them and pursue this direction in an open-ended way. And I think, this is probably not going to make any money for any specific company at the beginning, but this is NeurIPS, right? So I think this is going to really push the boundary, and it's really exciting to see, as we use this technology and scale things up, what kind of weird and novel ideas that will come up from just using these machines as creative machines in the next 5 to 10 years.
I'm excited by that possibility. Also, there's some more pedestrian applications of AI, like automating certain types of lab experiments. And it's really important to do that, and we're excited to do that. But even more exciting is what David just described, which is to have the machine sort of go end to end, start with a task, go through, perform it, take the information, and then reason from that to design the next experiment. You want put a human in the loop too, if you want, but presumably over time, it'll become more and more autonomous. So I'm excited by that possibility too.
Yeah, I think it's possible to automate every step of the process, but I'm not sure that's the goal, unless universities are going to be hiring AIs, or maybe just buying a lot of Nvidia GPUs and getting rid of their faculty and letting the GPUs, do the science. I think what's important is to give leverage to the scientist. I think you have to look at who's the user here and what they want. And when I was on Biden's PCAST, we did a study on the academic enterprise and productivity. It turns out the average American faculty member spends 40% of their time on grant administration. The first thing you want the AI to do is to get that out of the way, right? So you can focus on the science. And then you have to ask, what is the next thing that you'd like to offload to the AI? And that we can make it do anything, but we should decide what we want it to do and what will give the scientist the most leverage.
I mean, I would argue, repeating what I said before, ideas are plenty, right? What the real bottleneck is, knowing which of those ideas work in the physical world, in the real world. And the bottleneck is physical experimentation. I know you said nature does the computation for us then, but in most cases, that's still a lot of slow, and, it could take months. It could be really laborious to go do those experiments, right? To give you one example, I said we had AI design this medical catheter that reduced bacterial contamination by 100-fold. First of all, I was not aware that this is such an important problem because apparently the most common hospital-related infection is having medical catheters. And it's also based on physics because the bacteria tend to swim upstream, get into the human body, cause the infection against the fluid flow. So if we could, harness the principles of fluid dynamics itself to say, now I'm going to print these tiny triangular grooves inside the pipe and let it create vortices and make it more difficult for bacteria to swim upstream, right? Again, it was humans, it was our collaborators who came up with this general idea, but humans don't have the good intuition of saying what exactly is that shape, right? And if you look at standard fluid dynamics simulators, they are not differentiable, so it's not so easy to go fully optimized based on that. But with AI being able to understand fluid dynamics, we could fully do gradient-based optimization, come up with the best design, and then the whole process of 3D printing, doing all the microfluidic experiments, looking under the microscope, simulating bacterial particles, that all took time, but then we had to do it just once because we measured this 100-fold reduction in bacterial contamination. And that to me is the big promise, that can you make those discoveries where we have good confidence? And this is where I also go back to emphasizing making it physics informed or having some notion of being able to verify that this is correct. So in other areas, like even math, we have papers in the AI and math workshop where, it's discovering new theorems for solving a conjecture that is open, that's really research level and difficult, but we have lean, go and verify, right? So the role of verifiers is really critical. And in areas like math and physics, we can verify. Verification is much simpler and cheaper compared to actually coming up with a generation. And those are and also to codes to some extent, right? So those are the areas where we're seeing much more of the ability to make these novel discoveries, because you can easily rule out all the hay and get to the needle. And that's where, to me, it's an exciting future.
So they've mentioned that, on the idea of super intelligence, you cannot make a lot of money or maybe creativity, but you can sure get a lot of VC investment on that idea. I think there's quite a few companies out there that use super intelligence in their headline. They're quite well funded, I would say. Now, it's very hard to answer this question actually, because you have to give a timeline, right? So in 1,000 years, if humanity survives that long, which is not a real question, but if we survive that long, I'm sure there is something like that. Everything is there's a super intelligence. I do think it's not going to be very soon that everything is going to be automated, and the main reason for this is that I think building a lab and having robots run around doing the experiment is actually we're not there to actually completely automate that. And then there is, at the end of that process, there is also things like synthesizability and putting something into the real world, which is also very hard to automate.
Got it. Very good. And maybe a related question, but we've kind of zigzagged a little bit towards it, but maybe it's more specific this way. What does human AI collaboration look like going forward, maybe in the near future for AI for science? Will AI agents do all the work, or are humans still needed in the process in the near future?
You'd like to think they complement one another, so that humans bring something unique, that they have insights that can't be trained into the model, and by having the dialogue with the AI, kicking ideas back and forth to come up with hypotheses that are better than either could do on their own, and then AI will do all the work.
We certainly, with all the AI we do, we always see it as hypothesis generating. So the AI will provide designs of a molecule, and we will never test just one of them. We'll test a battery of them, partly because we're still in the learning phase, but partly because there's always going to be a little element of empiricism there. Today, it generates hypotheses, and we look at it and make decisions based on our intuition and knowledge. Over time, I want an AI that will also sort of rank things and give me probabilities. This one is more likely to work, but you might want to try this one too for the following reason. We're getting to the point where the AI can do more and more of that. I look forward to that day. I think for a long time, it's just going to be, generating hypotheses that we then, apply our minds to discerning.
I think right at at the current state, I think this technology is a great complement to. We should look at how many papers have been, reviewed partially by AI at the Europe conference.
Or entirely.
Is that a good thing?
I don't know whether we like it or not.
Yeah.
AI will be incorporated somehow
Yes.
by our grad students, and then and this is just going to happen. Whether we're doing menial data analysis tasks, hypothesis generation, reviewing papers, to writing rebuttals. What's the interesting point that I keep on thinking about is something that we can do it, but whether we should do it is like, as a scientist, like, doing science is fun, and coming up with new theories and discoveries, and pondering around what are it's interesting. And at some point, maybe the next generation of AI can do this, but that will take a lot of the fun out of the job, right? Like, I mean, right now we're having the same issue as in generative videos or images. Lots of artists are, that's a lot of creative process. It's fun to create a piece of art, but when a machine, a diffusion model can create it, it was like, what do we do afterwards, right? So I think one question to ask ourselves is when these technology can do the fun part of science, or whether they should be the boring part of science. Can we actually choose that, in this community?
So we'll go from professors spending 40% of their time writing grants, administering grants, to 40% of their time administering the AIs who are having fun. Is that the idea?
I mean, my prediction is the last things the human scientists will keep doing is AI. So, because a lot of like AI methods, I mean, we're nowhere near the end of research for AI, right? And that's why you're at the right venue. You're all at NeurIPS. So I think that aspect of how to make these AI methods better and better, so they could do higher level abstraction, higher level discovery, more verified and trustworthy discoveries. I mean, that's such an open problem, right? So I think like being able to tackle that means, yes, all of the other sciences get easier with AI, but through that whole process, we of course need the domain scientists. And my whole journey, right, being at Caltech, previously also at Nvidia, all of that has been always interdisciplinary. And we always go, I try to go and talk to the most skeptical scientists. I still remember Bill saying, "Oh, fluid dynamics, that is so difficult." So, so that's what we want, like those who can challenge and say, "No, AI, this is not good enough. We need something what truly matters for this application." And I think that in the frontier, nothing is still solved, right? Yes, we want to solve nuclear fusion. I was just at D3D facility here, General Atomics here in San Diego. I mean, it's just a wealth of like still unknown aspects of what plasma does. And we need all of the human scientists with their intuitions, but also all of the simulations that we could do. The more we can do in the virtual realm, right? Like then we do fewer such experiments in the real world and quickly validate. So that's a process, I think, that will continue our lifetime. That's not going to end. But ultimately, we can then go tackle the harder and harder challenges. And it's the same thing I tell my grad students. Picking the right problem is really most of the battle won. And so humans will be empowered and enabled to do more of that while AI does the heavy lifting. And I think that's a great thing.
At Cusp, we think of materials discovery as a search engine. So ultimately, that's a tool in the hands of a chemist or a material scientist. And so your basic task is to put the right prompt in with the right question, and then hopefully whatever happens in terms of computations and searching and generation and actual experiments, at some point a ranked list of candidates comes back, and then the chemist looks again at this ranked list and says, "Oh no, that's actually not what I meant," and then go back to the prompt and refine the prompt. So in some sense, it's a prompt engineer in the end with a very powerful tool. But also I would say the human is still responsible for the outcome. So in the end, somebody needs to be responsible for the material. If it's heavily toxic or whatever, the human must still be responsible. So that's also something that the human still needs to do.
Good. I want to go back to one of the questions that was sort of answered implicitly before, but the compute algorithms and data generation, which is being underestimated in terms of how difficult it will be to overcome AI in science. We've talked about, or you've talked about the importance of data curation. We've talked a bit about compute with Bill, but we haven't really talked about algorithmic developments. And my understanding is, many of the deep learning, pioneering ideas came out even in the late 80s and so on. Then you get some advances and you get the transformer architecture in 2017 paper. But did anybody have any comments on the algorithmic developments in the AI for science space?
I kind of alluded to that. So let me first repeat what I said. One aspect has been because there is less data available and also data of multiple kinds, right? Not just modalities, but also fidelities. And in many of these areas that directly relates to resolution. So you have coarse resolution. If you think of fluid dynamics, that's approximate, that does not capture all of the turbulence effects, especially in highly turbulent like rockets or aircrafts. So you make those approximations, you come up with some answers, but then to get the exact answer, it's a much more expensive simulation. And so what if you had a lot more data that's approximate, a little bit of additional data that is more precise, or just the laws of physics that you incorporate to make it more precise than even the training data. The whole aspect of extrapolation and exceeding the quality of training data is what requires new algorithmic advances. So making these algorithms physics informed means the loss functions get a lot more complicated. And then we also need to think of a curriculum of loss functions. Maybe if you impose and say, I want all of this physics to be always satisfied, it just becomes an intractable optimization problem. The example I gave was the Millennium Prize problem, where if we knew how to optimize the profile function to find the singularity, we'd be done, right? We'd solve that, but we just don't know how. And we don't know if it exists, but we also don't have an optimization certificate that says whether this is optimized or not. So that's where the challenge remains. So optimization is a really big challenge. The curriculum, both in terms of the data quality, the loss and reward like function. And when it comes to what we think of test time scaling in more language realm, for the physical world, that is like inverse problems. Okay, I kind of have an understanding of what the forward dynamics look like. For instance, say an example of earthquake. I know how waves propagate, but I don't know what's underneath the earth. I can never go and verify. Or the imaging of the black hole, that is the famous example, where we never truly know what that is, right? So you never can get to the ground truth, but you need to be able to do this. And I give the analogy of test time scaling because even if you had a very good forward simulator, a model that understands the physics, can simulate, you still need to come up with the right answers for the inverse problem and in an efficient way. One of our posters that I'm shamelessly advertising today where we did this was to do this posterior sampling. Again, it's not one answer, it'll be a whole host of answers because when it comes to inverse problems, you have uncertainty. You don't know exactly where the earthquake is going to be. You will come up with a distribution, and doing that precisely in these high dimensional problems is very difficult. So those are algorithmic advances where we've taken diffusion models, but made them into neural operators and made them work at any resolution. Those can then solve these hard scientific challenges. So those are just some examples of what to me are some deep algorithmic challenges in this field. And I think we need all of you to think more about algorithms. This is the age of algorithms and age of research.
I think algorithms are at an interesting stage. There's a period of time when the models we used changed very rapidly. Going from ConvNets, and then we used recursive neural networks of various types. Since we settled on transformers do a wonderful job. Our latest weather model is actually based on transformers and exceeds performance of our previous models that had very carefully crafted spherical geometry. The creativity now in algorithms, I think, falls in two categories. First is test time scaling. We have a set of models that generates molecules, given prompts for what kind of molecules you want, and they've gotten a huge boost in the figure of merit that they're trying to generate by allowing them to reason and do a lot of test time scaling. So without having more data, without really increasing the complexity of the model, just using more compute, as it were, you're able to get better answers out of things. Then the other big innovation in algorithms I'm seeing today is making transformers better. And a lot of this has to do with the attention mechanism. The attention mechanism is quadratic. It's hugely expensive. Every token is attending to every other token, and it doesn't need to. And I think the best innovations I've seen recently in transformers are people who come up with clever ways of making that attention linear, or at least n log n rather than quadratic, without losing any of the accuracy of the underlying model. I think that's where the power is. But it shows that we've reached a stage of maturity. We're not changing things helter-skelter anymore. We've kind of found the basic model that works, and people are improving upon it.
Maybe I can challenge that a little bit, because I think because we are optimizing algorithms for the hardware and the hardware gets optimized for the algorithm, we kind of in a local minimum, right? Because if, we could come up with another algorithm with a completely different hardware, which could do way, way better. And so maybe it's just because we've sort of dug ourselves into this local optimum, maybe. And sort of it's very hard, like economically, to get out of that in some sense. I also want to add, there's actually a huge number of important algorithms in this field, and I can call out a bunch of co-authors which are sitting here, and there is a Scala for DFT, and there's FermiNet and PauliNet. Actually, I would say all the way up to PDEs, and of course there's Fourier operators here, and so across the whole multi-scale spectrum of physics, there is a simulation method, and then there is a sort of trained surrogate method that accelerates that often by many orders of magnitude, actually. That's on the simulation, sort of the verification side. But then there's also, of course, the generation side, where we now can generate molecules, new molecules that no person has ever seen, where the universe has never seen that molecule. So we can now generate that. It's really fascinating, I find. And then there is agents which can now search much more efficiently, search the literature much more efficiently. And so I think there's a whole spectrum of new algorithms which are invented now to help discover new materials.
I also just want to set the record straight on, since you mentioned weather model and spherical geometry and transformer, actually the latest ForecastNet 3 that still uses spherical geometry beats these transformer and other models. So we are, it's always, and I don't want to get into the race of which one is better, right? But I think to also Max's point, yes, transformers are the ones that are popular. Everybody kind of jumps on it. But there is value to building in like spherical geometry, like the spherical Fourier neural operators, where, yes, we are able to match in accuracy. But the benefit is if you run all of these different models to much longer time. So, because what's done during training is you train it to just predict the next 6 hours, and a little bit further you fine tune. And it does, all these models do pretty well, I would say exchangeably well. About 2 weeks when it's the predictable window of the weather. But if we now run it for an entire year, that's when we talk about climate, right? Because you want to ask what are the average statistics, and this is important if you want to model climate change. And this is where having the spherical geometry has a big impact, because, if you assume the world is a rectangle and you keep rolling out these models, what happens is distortions start at the polar region and they just go everywhere. And so you have the blow-ups because error builds up in the autoregressive rollouts. Whereas the spherical geometry keeps this notion that it's a sphere, and so long rollouts stabilize. And I think this is where the value of adding some of the equivariance or symmetries, like some of the domain geometry, depending on the problem, especially if the data is limited, or the other example is extrapolation. It was never trained to predict for a year, but now we want to make this model zero-shot work there. That's where I think those become useful. So in many cases, when people say equivariance doesn't help, they're all the time just thinking of in distribution. The training and test distribution are similar. I agree that equivariance may actually be a roadblock, because optimizing with equivariance is harder. But if we talk about these hard extrapolation problems, that's where being physics-informed, geometry-informed becomes more of a game changer.
I like this question about algorithmic discovery and data. Both are very important, as you alluded to. I think data is really important to verify our theories and algorithms. I think there's a parallel with what's going on in scaling up transformers in data. Like many talks at NeurIPS this time, it's like there's not enough data to train our models anymore. What we're doing is now we're having pre-training, mid-training, post-training. And the post-training is the data that's produced by the pre-trained model. I think we're going to see something similar in AI for science. I like the idea of the algorithms being in the search space. So many of our generative AI tools can produce new algorithms. I think what we're going to see is these algorithms will be produced and being used to generate new data to verify these algorithms as a flywheel. And I think this is the only way when we can
scale up the discovery for algorithms to eventually, hopefully, replace the transformer as well. My view is like, doesn't work, but I think right now, it's
sorry, no batteries. Yeah, like we are at the very early stage of LLMs and AI agents, and just like how I think we're at the mainframe era of compute and mainframe era of LLMs, and in the next decades, I think this technology will just get much more efficient. And my hope is this algorithmic discovery using generative AI would be used to make this technology, 10,000 or 100,000 times more efficient by discovering new algorithms, using these algorithms to produce new data points to verify this efficiency. And I think we're on a pretty good trajectory to get there.
Good. Another comment or good?
I just want to say that I agree with the symmetry part. So actually, I find this a completely fascinating discussion because it's like the pendulum goes back and forth. So one day, I think symmetries are great. We need to put these sort of inductive biases in our models, but then somebody figures out we actually don't have to do it, and it's much better if you don't do it. And then the next day somebody proves it's good again. So I really want to understand where that discussion ends. To me, it can only end in one place. If you have a perfect inductive bias, you should be able to use it. It'd be very disappointing if you can't use it.
It's a perfect thing to end on. Let's thank our panelists.
Thank you.
And we will acknowledge the sponsors, NEA, Nvidia, CuspAI, Sakana AI, and Samsung next.